Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This is a part two of our three-part series entitled Crawl, Walk, Run on IT Asset and Configuration Management. This is part two entitled Walk, Making the Use of Your Data. Okay, so for today's agenda, we really want to kind of cover off there are a couple of things that we're going to go over. Two primary topics, actually, that are critical, best practices for asset impact analysis, including dependency mapping and supportive change management. So we're going to give you a demo of that. And then we're going to take a deeper dive on managing your assets in the overall life cycle. Again, we're going to interdisperse these best practices with the actual demonstration of how these best practices can be achieved using the Ivanti toolset, okay? So just real quick, a couple of housekeeping items. Please queue up your questions in the Zoom chat. We'll have ample time during and after the webinar presentation to answer any questions you may have. Go ahead and feel free to queue those up. And the other thing that I just want to make everybody aware of is that we're going to have two poll questions, again, like we did last time, so we can have a little bit of audience interaction. Really what it does is help us better understand what your companies are actually doing in this space, okay? So that's be on the lookout for those. We'd like to have everybody participate, all right? So let me introduce it just real quick. We did this last time, but there may be some of those of you on the phone that were not introduced to the speakers last time. So let me introduce myself first. I'm Bert Lassley. I've spent 30 years in the IT arena, the past 15 or so, specifically in the ITSM and ITIL space, and the last 6 specifically using and implementing the Ivanti product for our customer base, okay? I would also like to introduce Rob Ferrello. He's a 25-year veteran and the ITAM lead, at Ivanti. And Rob is a member also of the International Association of ITAM and a true expert in this field. Another individual on here is Paul Bussiere. Paul is an accomplished enterprise architect with over 20 years of experience in this specific space. He specializes in consulting with companies specifically around business service management and service asset and configuration management. So you're going to hear from both of these gentlemen today. Paul's going to kind of set up the context of the discussion with the best practice, and then Rob's going to kind of tag team with them and actually show you how that best practice facilitates itself within the Ivanti platform, okay? So before we do that, let me just quickly review what we started our last session introducing asset configuration management and why it's such a popular topic today. Really, the main reason, as we kind of alluded to, was that there's a bunch of technology out there now. It's finally caught up with the market drivers, which are typically fall into one of 3 categories. It's things around cost savings, compliance, or probably the most important thing to a lot of folks on this phone, service improvement. However, as we demonstrated, technology alone, doesn't solve the problem. You really have to, it takes people and it takes process. So what we've done for this particular webinar, we've preceded each of these demonstrations by presetting the context with the best practices themselves. So you understand, okay, this is why you would do this, and here's how you would do it within the platform, okay? So the last time we got together, we really talked about setting the foundation for, ITAM, and we went through these three best practices, specifically around, hey, here's the best practice around design, here's the best practice around managing the life cycle. We're going to take a deeper dive today into the life cycle itself, okay? So let me go to the actual maturity pyramid here for a minute and kind of just, before I hand it off to Paul. Today's session, we're really going to focus on how to use the data that we set up in the foundation, okay, in session 1 to take the next step on the journey. The whole idea is that we want to move up the maturity curve. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to do that from an impact analysis on the left-hand side for configuration management. And we're going to show you what we think you need to do specifically around the asset lifecycle management process, and how you can move up the curve there as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul B at this point, who will set up best practice number 1, specifically around the impact analysis.
Yep. So before we flip to the next, good morning, everybody. This, the maturity pyramid here is just something that, we talked about as a graphic that we saw in our previous webinar a couple weeks ago. Just a couple things to touch on this to talk about. So, again, as Bert mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on level 2, which is really, again, around impact analysis from a change impact, from the configuration management perspective, and then, of course, asset lifecycle for IT asset management. So just a couple quick items for review, things I want to touch on, a few important points regarding the maturity pyramid. So our maturity pyramid here is arranged by outcomes. We think it's important, obviously, these outcomes are built upon each other, both from a process as well as a data perspective. This becomes very important because, of course, these become obtainable goals that you can focus your process, or your project around. So, of course, you have a properly defined project, becomes very important to be able to understand what those outcomes are. And at each level of the pyramid, there are activities that are required to achieve that level, and from both from a process as well as a data perspective. And again, it's important to remember that these outcomes are aligned along the processes that they fall under, right? So impact analysis is of course around configuration management. Requires, is if we're those folks that remember or that joined us in the last call, we talked about, obviously, configuration management is really focused around the relationships between items that you have. So of course, impact analysis is one of those key attributes that's associated with that. And then, of course, from a IT asset management perspective, we're going to be focusing on understanding that life cycle. As you move up the maturity pyramid, certainly on the asset side, we get more in depth around understanding and utilizing the full life cycle of that asset. This becomes very important as we perform those actions that we want from an asset perspective around planning. So these, again, as you'll see, as we continue to kind of move up this pyramid, these become more in-depth and more specific related processes that align to those individual high-level processes, right? From a configuration management perspective and asset management perspective, they become more and more specialized, and the usage of data, or the use of that data, while it's still based upon that basic fundamental asset repository or CI repository, the individual processes themselves become more divergent, right? So they'll diverge continuously as they move up because they become more specialized in each of the different processes. Okay, next slide. So best practice number 1 that we're going to be talking about today is around impact analysis. And from our perspective, and this is something that I have found through trial and error, which is it's best practice in this case is really understanding or work when you're dealing with impact analysis is starting with applications, right? So the reason why this is so important, and I understand that this may feel a little prescriptive in this case, but it becomes more evident as we sort of kind of get through and look at the justification as to why we think this is so important. When you're starting with service mapping or impact analysis, it's important to starting with something So you have to understand what the context is. Again, an application is a construct that you're ultimately defining what that's going to look like. An application is something that's often well known to IT personnel, other than the alternative would be, of course, a business service. And we'll talk about those as we move further up the maturity cycle, because business services become very important as we sort of kind of begin to look at how we quantify what IT does and how we want to define that. But starting with the impact analysis, we want to start with something we know, which of course in this case is applications. Now, again, just to touch on what a service is, as we oppose, define this or define what a business service is. A service from an ITIL perspective means, is a means of delivering value to customers by facilitating outcomes customers want to achieve without the ownership of a specific cost. So if we put this in context of a business service is the service that you're ultimately delivering, that IT is delivering to the business. Business services should be defined from the customer's point of view, and business services should have agreed upon SLA, right? So the reason why we're focusing on starting with applications and starting with something that is because an application is very technology specific. It's very something, it's not service, it's not as unknown or unquantifiable as, or something new that you're attempting to try to define within the context of your impact analysis performance, right? And so what we find with that, and the reason why, again, we're focusing around applications as opposed to services, is that often the task of defining that service, if we follow the quote unquote best practices here, and we begin to define that service, we often find the process of defining that service outstrips the impact analysis, the value proposition of actually building out the impact, or performing the impact analysis and understanding the relationships. So that vision gets lost. I mean, there's so much work that needs to be done often when you're shifting from technology perspective to service-based perspective, that becomes something where the value proposition gets lost. So again, our approach here is to start with something that that is well defined, and yet something that is still quite meaningful. IT understands what applications are. They understand how to deliver those applications. These are things that they, essentially, often, in many cases, IT is set up around delivering those functions or those applications that everybody understands, right? We all know, oh, well, PeopleSoft is having problems or something along those lines. Those applications are going to be defined or be well understood, as opposed to, I'm delivering my financial services function, or I'm delivering, something along those things that are as a little less understood or defined. So, and again, the one key thing, the last thing I'll say about this when we talk about leveraging applications is, as you build out these impact relationship models, while you're dealing with an application as opposed to a service, you still gain all the benefits, right? You still gain all the benefits of understanding or driving down or understanding your impact from an application perspective. What is the impact of making a change on a server? How many applications am I impacting? What is the level of that impact? Those kinds of things. You just don't have to, again, it becomes something very meaningful and something where you can drive value far more quickly. So, all right. Rob?
All right, so let's jump into a little bit of a live demo and kind of display a lot of what Paul just talked about. So built into the Ivanti service management platform are several out-of-box dashboards. I thought I'd start us around our out-of-box change management dashboard, which allows us to see very quickly all of the changes pending approval. So this widget or column here in the middle might be a list of a report of tickets that goes out to all the members of the CAB, the day or couple days prior to the change advisory board meeting, so that you're aware of what's pending approval. Here's a change that I've just started. Before I submit it to the CAB for approval and potentially have to stand up and defend my change or represent my change, let's take a look at the change that's created here. This is to replace a network card in the SQL Server. And as you can see, I have an asset attached to this change. This is the SQL Server whose network card is going to be changed. We're also affecting the data service because this is the service that's down. This is the service that customers are calling in about. They can't access Microsoft SQL databases, and so upon investigation, we found that the network card in that SQL Server is bad. Now, as part of our standard change process, we have a risk assessment. It would be good for me to properly fill out the risk assessment before submitting my change to the CAB. But in order to do this intelligently, I really need to take a look at what I'm changing. And that's where the impact analysis becomes very critical. If we start by looking at the data service, this is like what Paul was saying. It's an application that customers consume. It's our database services. And potentially there are multiple applications that consume this particular service. If we wanted to understand how this service is mapped out, there is a service map that the CMDB provides. It's a way to visualize the relationships between assets and servers and devices within the data center, and how those relate to the things, the services that customers consume. So here you can see that we have our data service at the top level, and the data service relies on the network service to be up and running. So that kind of makes sense. And the web hosting services, an underpinning service as well. All of this relates back to a SQL server, which is actually a cluster of servers. And it's this Sydney SQL server here, number 2 in the cluster that's bad, that we need to go and take down. And so we can simulate that outage here. And see that by taking down that SQL server, it's going to affect the SQL cluster and the ERP system, and the data service will go down. But more importantly, if we re-centralize, this is a top-down view from the data service. If we flip the telescope around, so to speak, and look from the bottom up, here we can see that Sydney SQL server actually maps back to several potential services that customers consume. There's the desktop service and the finance application and ERP and HR, as well as the data service. So there's potentially many teams who are going to be affected when we simulate this outage. If we run into the data center with our hair on fire to replace this network card in this server, there's going to be a lot of teams that are going to need to be affected. And that's where the beauty of having these relationships and these service maps come into play. Because now you can traverse the relationship tree and say, go 3 levels, 4 levels, 5 levels deep, and notify all the CI owners or application owners that there's going to be an outage, and either have them involved in the approval or the notification process. So the impact analysis really drives better change management. It eliminates or minimizes unplanned outages. And it really enables the change manager to get a good, accurate understanding of what they're affecting before they go forward with a risk assessment and submitting it for approval. Now, that impact analysis map, that service map, that can be built manually if you have subject matter experts who really understand how applications are interconnected. But Ivanti offers a solution called Neurons for Service Mapping, which is solely dedicated and focused on the data center discovery and private cloud, and can find all of the applications that are being served to your customers, map them out in your environment, understand their relationships, their communication paths, and then allow you to publish them into the CMDB so that you can do an impact analysis like I just showed. If you have any questions, feel free to chat them in. We'll be sure to address them. And I'll pass it back to Paul here in a moment.
Okay. I think we've got a poll question coming up here.
Oh, goodness, clicking on me. Does your company have the ability to view, question out of my way, view asset relationships or dependency mapping? So can you view how assets are interrelated within your data center or private cloud? And are you able to do that within your current IT service management platform? Yes, no, or perhaps you're not sure. All right, poll's open, and looks like we're getting great participation. Thank you so much for responding.
Yeah, that's great. We have several folks who are actually who have this, who have impact analysis already in place. That's great.
All right, thanks so much.
Sounds great. So there's a few of you that do, a large majority don't. Some are unsure. So yeah, we find that, often with this impact analysis is certainly a difficult subject. It takes some specialized capabilities to really sort of kind of dig into that and do it well. So certainly Ivanti has a capability to help with that process, right, from a technology perspective. All right. So best practice number 2. So here we're going to be talking about the asset lifecycle, and the best practice in this case is really focused around leveraging day-to-day activities to support that asset management lifecycle, right? So what's important here is we don't want to get into a process of managing data. So you're going to have a vast amount of information that you want to be able to capture and manage within the context of your asset repository, right? So your asset repository, however many devices, is going to be, we're dealing with assets, we're dealing with everything. So endpoints all the way through to what servers and network equipment do you ultimately own, right? So huge and often, the vast number of devices. So managing that on a day-to-day from a data perspective is just untenable. So again, what we want to focus around is being able to provide a process in place that's going to help support that life cycle, right? And when we think about the life cycle, we do break it up into 3 areas. We talk about the asset acquisition, the life cycle, and disposal, right? And really what we want to do in this case is rely on your other ITSM processes to support this and to build this process out for you. So what I mean by that is some common service requests is really where we're going to focus a lot of this in here. And service request is in around, so for example, we want to request new equipment. That's going to be, how you require. Now, there's a lot of steps that we can add within that process around requesting equipment, meaning that, I receive a service request for a new PC, or I have a new hire, onboarding new employees, whatever that origination of that type of service request is. Essentially, at the end of the day, I need to give them a new piece of equipment. That new piece of equipment, I need to determine whether or not I can fulfill from stock, or I need to acquire that piece of equipment, right? So we group that entire sort of like basic workflow within the acquire equipment perspective, or the acquisition, because essentially what you're doing is you're getting it ready to deploy that piece of equipment, right? So there can be several service requests that fall underneath that initial request for new equipment, or the acquire process. But here, what's important is if you're able to drive that group of functionality through a service request, then again, it becomes a day-to-day activity. So the result of that service request ultimately becomes the update to the data in the system. So initially, what you're dealing with is, from an asset management perspective, is setting up that initial process. So you need to set up your storerooms, you need to set up those types of data elements, so that when you do define your service request, it'll fall in line and allow you to enable that those parts of the process, or be able to work within that context. So again, we also think, of course, from a life cycle perspective around break fix. I have a broken computer, I needed it fixed. I need to, update, do updates to the PC. I need to do whatever those life cycle activities that you're doing. I need to change. I'm changing jobs. I need a new lead. I need, if I'm changing positions or changing departments, perhaps I knew getting a new piece of equipment at that particular point in time. So all of those life cycle activities can also be broken up into specific activities, specific service requests. Certainly, and just break fix being one example of that. And then, of course, the disposal equipment, offboarding, a great example. So offboarding an employee could result in the disposal of that piece of equipment, depending on how old it is, right? So there's a lot of nuance that falls into this, but as well, at a very high level, this could be something where you can establish at least 3 main service requests that can help facilitate the support of your overall asset lifecycle, at the very least, right? And what you'll do is ultimately, over time, we can add additional service requests to help support different specific aspects of this life cycle. But what's key again is the takeaway from this is that we don't want to necessarily attempt to try to manage the updates to these assets directly. We do that through some type of service request. And one aspect of this best practice certainly is around the best practice of never making changes to your assets without some type of auditability around it, right? So having a service request tells us why you've made that change to that asset. And we want to be able to track that information because, of course, if we're going to tie financial information from this and make very important financial related decisions around what information is contained in your asset repository, it becomes very important to trace why and be able to prove the current state of those devices and why they're in that state. So there's a lot of additional benefits by pushing some of this into this, what I call day-to-day activities, but also being able to control your assets through your service request process, right? So that's certainly key. So just in summary around this best practice, this is, support your life cycle by using your service request process. So that your updates can be part of your standard day-to-day activities, right? And then, of course, utilizing service requests to provide the auditability for the change made to that particular asset, right? So again, we gain two major benefits by leveraging service requests in this example. One, being able to support and begin to define that full asset lifecycle, and then two, of course, being able to support that auditability that's going to be required as we begin to build this out. But again, as an example, we can start with 3 basic service requests: request to equipment, do a break fix, offboarding equipment. Those 3 basic services allow us to at least begin that process of supporting those that life cycle, or begin building out that life cycle. Great.
All right, so time for another live demo. Thanks, Paul. I'll try to bring to life within the product some of the things that you just talked about. And again, I like to start with some of the out-of-box dashboards that are going to give you snapshots and visibility into the day-to-day activity. Number one, on the acquisition side, there are dashboards for monitoring your procurement workflows, which purchase orders are active, what equipment are you expecting to receive? When I was in IT, I used to hear all the time from my boss, did we get what we bought? Did we get what we bought? It was a very difficult question to answer back then. Now with Ivanti, you can do that easy peasy. You can look and very quickly and easily and see, here's a purchase order that we're currently tracking. There are 10 assets within that purchase order for 10 new Chromebooks. Several of them have come in already and have been received, and they're in stock. One of them has already been assigned out to a user, and several of them are still on order waiting to be received. If you're on the loading dock and you're the person I call an IT gatekeeper who is responsible for receiving these devices, uncartoning the stuff from Dell or CDW or Lenovo, and you're going to take custody of them, then you can use Ivanti to do that receiving process. Here in the web console, I would simply select take delivery and receive them, but we also have a mobile app which would allow you to scan them in and enter them into the product as well. Once they're in stock, you can leverage them for things like asset requests. So as Paul was mentioning, service requests are really going to be the front end of the life cycle for many assets. So in this case, I'm looking at a new hire, just to hopefully make you chuckle a little bit on the other side of the microphone there. We're going to hire Elon Musk to be the VP of social media, and he's going to work in our Colorado Springs office. So one of the tasks that was generated out of this new hire was assigned to me, the asset manager, to assign a new laptop. So I'll jump into my stock management area. We'll take a look at what we have within Colorado Springs. And sure enough, we've got a lot of hardware within that storage facility. We want to take a closer look at the different types of assets that we have in there. We can assign printers and switches and laptops and desktops. We'll jump in here and grab one of the Lenovo's. We'll assign it to the user. And as we do that, I'll assign it to Ali Admin. as we do that, we're not only going to update the asset record to say it's now assigned to Ally admin, it's no longer in stock, and it's Ally's in the Colorado Springs location, but we can also simultaneously kick off a help desk ticket to the desktop team to say, go fetch that asset out of the Colorado storage facility with serial number 45732 and service tag or asset tag 8652, and provision it and deliver it to Ally. So at some point, I like to think, Ally may someday hit the lottery, right? Maybe Ally hits Powerball someday, and she decides that she no longer needs to work. So Ally's employee record is currently active, but once she lets HR know that she's hit Powerball and she's not coming back, well, her status can flip to terminated through a feed from the HR system. That can automatically spawn the retrieval process of Ally's asset that was assigned earlier in the life cycle. So maybe Ally's manager or security or Ally herself gets notified that this asset with a particular service tag, serial number has been assigned to you and is expected to be returned to IT. So just as a quick example of how you can tie in through the offboarding routines, if this is at some point this asset needed to be disposed of because it's reached its end of life, there are disposal workflows within the Ivanti solution as well. If you come under the various life cycle states, right, these kind of really point out all of the key moments that an asset is going to go throughout its life cycle. They're gates or moments, key points in its life cycle. It's coming, it's on order, it's been checked into stock, it's assigned out to user, it's been rechecked in and it's being repurposed, or it's being disposed of. And even disposal has its own sort of nuances and workflows where you want to isolate that laptop from the network, you want to reclaim its software titles and disable its network access, you want to perform a disk wipe of it and get your certificate for it so that if it ever shows up in the green dumpster behind the bowling alley and the EPA traces it back to you, you can show your disposal certificate and you're not liable for all the contaminants that are contained within the motherboard, like the lead and the mercury and so on. So that's just a brief overview of how Ivanti can help throughout the entire asset lifecycle, from procurement through support and ongoing management, all the way through the disposal and offboarding processes. We'll jump to our next poll question. Does your company have the ability to manage the entire life cycle process from acquisition through support and all the way on through disposal? Yes, no, or partially? Again, we're getting great participation. Thank you so much for responding. Looks like we've got a lot of folks who are able to do some portion of it, which is great because, it definitely provides some value, but maybe you're seeing some areas here today that can add additional value within your asset practice.
Great. Yeah, it looks like, a majority of folks are partially, so they have some parts of this defined. That's great. That's a good start. And certainly this is where, we talked about in the previous meeting, the previous presentation, one of the key areas is around having your process owners in place and being able to leverage continuous improvement. So of course, this is an area where continuous improvement can continue to, as we talked about, adding additional service requests to support different areas of the life cycle. So again, this is where we can begin to really tighten up. Obviously, day one, it's difficult to move all the way into having your full life cycle defined within the tool, but certainly something that you can work towards over time, right? Begin to take advantage of that over the course of the time. So great. And then any questions?
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions in the queue.
Oh, wonderful.
Rob and Paul, do you want to
Yeah.
take those?
Sure. Well, let's start with one that I answered already in chat, which is Ivanti Neurons for ITSM available on the market today now? You're a Sharewell customer, and you've heard that ITSM will not be available to the general public until Q3, Q4 of 2023. So let me correct some of that information there. So first of all, Ivanti Neurons for ITSM is absolutely available today. It's a very established product with a very large customer base. For Sharewell customers specifically, there are features that are currently being converged into the ITSM platform that you would be very familiar with as a Sharewell customer. Ivanti has a similar feature to the one step. We called it quick actions, but it didn't have a graphical designer from that you would be familiar with. That is currently being worked on to be more in line with the Sharewell capabilities. There's some API technology that Sharewell had that was, I would say, a little more advanced than what Ivanti had. That's also being included into Ivanti for Ivanti Neurons for ITSM, and some other features as well that will support essentially the migration of Sharewell customers should they choose to Ivanti Neurons for ITSM. There is a migration wizard, which is currently being developed and being tested that will enable customers to migrate their data and forms and workflows from a Sharewell environment to an ITSM environment. So the reason why you've been told that it's not available today is because as a Sharewell customer, that migration process is still being fine-tuned. We're hoping that we'll start having the first customers go through that process either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. So Q4 to Q1 of 2023, not the end of 2023. So we hope to be able to offer Sharewell customers the ability to migrate starting at the end of this year, early next year. There will be no requirement for Sharewell customers to migrate. You will have the ability to do so if you choose, and there will be some like-for-like swap outs with the product entitlements. I'm an engineer. I don't really have much more details than that at this point, but hopefully that sheds some light as to the convergence between Sharewell CSM and Ivanti Neurons for ITSM. What about Ivanti Neurons for ITSM specific? What will be the impact on current or future licensing when Sharewell customers move to Ivanti? I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer for you specifically on that. Again, there will be a migration process for customers who choose to migrate. There is no requirement to migrate. And I encourage you to reach out to your salesperson to start those conversations. They may not have all the answers, as a lot of the fine print, if you will, is still being worked out at this point. Can a terminated employee, moving on, Deborah, can a terminated employee also trigger software subscription terminations? Yes, absolutely. So that can be done in a couple of ways. We would trigger a workflow that would start the termination or retrieval process, reharvesting process of various entitlements or subscriptions that the customer has. Through our automation capabilities within our workflow engine, we could actually reach out to third-party platforms like Salesforce or Office 365 and do disablement or entitlement, remove the entitlement of folks' licenses from an automated workflow perspective. So they could either be manual tasks that go out to asset managers to perform those tasks, or we can create automation workflows within there. Yes, the last one, yes, there is a mobile app for ITSM and ITAM. The app is available in the Android and iOS stores, respectively. It's no charge. You can download it at any time. And there are specific mobile roles which you would be granted, your account would be granted in order to access, whether it be self-service or the technician interface or the ITAM asset manager interface, or all three.
We do have another question here. If you have foundations currently in place, how long does it typically take to achieve level 2 status on the maturity pyramid? So I'll take a stab at that a little bit. Typically, if you have a technology in place, depending on how integrated that technology currently is. Obviously, what we're looking for is essentially a feed of information into your CMDB that will, and if you're using a consolidated tool, of course, like Ivanti, then this all kind of comes as packages together. So again, the deployment of if all of that technology components are deployed in place, typically what you're looking at is at least, I would say probably at least a 3-week initial period to begin to focus around some key applications. And that would be something where that would be, of course, an ongoing. So I would suspect around, typically what we see is around a 3-week deployment process to define what an application is, and then start ensuring that you're walking through the relationship process. So define the application, understand its overall impact, its definition, and then be able to start working through the mapping of that. Obviously, there are additional technologies and a lot of factors that play a role in this, determining what that timeline is going to look like. But if we were to throw something against a wall, this is where I would start is something along that line, because essentially what you're doing is you're going to need to go back to the application owners. You're going to need to understand what that application, the context of what that really application is, and then validate the process of discovery. Because sometimes what will happen is you may have one or more process that may be running on a particular machine or system, and then what will be brought into an application model that's being built by a tool may include more items than you may necessarily want within the context of that application, or vice versa, right? So you may have things that at the time of discovery, it didn't necessarily pick up a component, and you want to tie some things together. So because you may be defining what that application looks like a little bit more broadly than how the technology may. So there's a little back and forth there that plays a role into defining what that application is going to look like, and then ultimately the impact relationship map that aligns to that. So yeah, that's where I would start with that. And Rob, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think that, a lot of customers also may be in a position where they have a discovery solution, and it may be doing some rudimentary feeding of the CMDB, but they're kind of wondering, where do they go next? I mean, what would you recommend, Paul, if they were in that kind of position?
Yeah, so it really, again, the first step I would determine is what is the outcome that we're looking for, right? So what are we trying to achieve? If we're looking for impact analysis at that point, then what we really need to look at is, does that discovery solution provide the relationship information that we need? If it's not, those relationship maps can be manually created and manually managed. However, I would it's not for the faint of heart, is what I would say. You have to be very regimented in how you make changes, because you'll control that process through the change management process typically. And you have to be very specific on how you track those changes and determine what impact or what changes what impact those changes have on your relationship model. So, so often it's best to kind of leverage a technology in this space. So if your discovery solution is not providing that information, then that might be an area we kind of focus on. But if you're looking for asset management and your discovery solution is in place, the next step I would say is certainly in line with what we talked about today, which is focus around, let's wrap some additional ITSM processes around that. So if we're looking for asset management capabilities, the first step is let's start to define that life cycle, right? So let's start getting, because information that's coming from discovery will typically come in as new, and items that are new in your asset repository is a red flag. In often cases, it means that you don't have any information prior to when that system was already deployed. So what we want to do from an asset management perspective is make sure that we've got all of that back information. So we know where the device came from, we know when it was ordered, when it was received, where it was stored, where it got moved to, how it got deployed to that person. So ultimately, how did it end up on the network and get discovered? If we don't have that information, then again, as I mentioned, that's a red flag, both from a process breakdown perspective as well as a security perspective. We have something with an IP address on your network and you don't know what it is, that's an issue. So from that perspective, my suggestion would be, let's start building out those service requests, right? So let's start taking that data, start breaking it down, start to understand what is the current state of that information, and then start wrapping those service requests and the other, the service requests around managing that information.
Yeah, well, it sounds like an asset manager's best friend is the procurement department. Right?
Yeah,
So
it
they
sure
got to
is.
work hand in hand. Great.
Yep, absolutely. Great.
Well, I think we covered all the questions, unless somebody else has one that they want to chat in at this point.
While we're waiting on that, let me go ahead and kind of pitch a little, make a little commercial for our next session, which will be on October 6th. And really what we're going to march up the curve again, and we're going to really talk about two topics. One, you've heard today, Paul and Rob talk specifically a lot about service management. Well, what we're really going to do is take the next step in understanding how the applications really are defined to create both technical and business services, and then how you can, once you really understand how that's done under the covers, and then once you understand that, how it provides you with the ability to manage your quality of service going forward. So that'll be on the configuration management side. As we move up the asset management side, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive on the software asset management and show you how you can manage entitlements, as well as, some of the other allocation aspects of the software itself, how you can make sure that you're within compliance or not, and be able to manage that process as well. So more to come next time when we get through, but we're working our way up the maturity pyramid. We'll be covering those two specific topics. Okay. Did any other questions come in at this point?
Yeah, there's one more question, Bert and Paul and Robert,
All
right there in the panelist chat.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let's
We've heard of many organizations that have struggled with their asset management initiatives. From your experience, what are the key things that we should focus on to avoid so we don't achieve, so we can achieve our goals? So this is a great question. So a lot of what we talked about today will focus directly around that. Certainly it depends, again, if we're talking about asset management initiatives, often when we see a lot of, 60 or 80% of CMDB initiatives fail. And again, I think that, as a broad statement, one of the areas that we really kind of run into with that I've seen in my career over time and time again that's caused issues is a lot of times what the initiatives focus on is managing data. And that is just not, that will not get you where you need to go, especially certainly from a CMDB perspective. I worked for, a major retailer, grocery retailer in the United States for a period of time. When we started that CMDB, the focus around that was really kind of understanding that information. Well, that CMDB grew to having over 6.5 million CIs in the CMDB. And, of course, you can't manage that much data, right? I mean, there's just no way you can actually maintain that with a team of people. There's just no way. So really it was kind of, we need to focus around building the process that will ultimately keep that data up to date, right? That's really where you want to focus, right? So we want to focus around those things, again, as I talked about from an asset perspective, is focus around utilizing your day-to-day activities, those things that everybody has to do on a day-to-day activity, day-to-day perspective. I'm going to have to deliver this laptop, or I'm going to have to, somebody has a broken laptop, or I need to deploy a server for some application. Any of these types of functions that people are doing on day-to-day perspective. We just need to tie into those functions and those processes and ensure that the data that we need is being updated as part of that, right? That is really where this kind of comes down to, is being able to ensure that you have the process that you leverage those functions, and you create a process around managing that data, and not get into the weeds around trying to manage it, because you can't scale that. This is something you can't do. So that would be one area that I think that I've seen many areas, many folks have trouble with that. So
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Well, we just have one last slide here, kind of covering the product set that we've viewed over the last couple of webinars. So mainly what we've talked about is neurons for ITAM. That's Ivanti neurons for ITAM includes the lifecycle management, the procurement processes, stock management, standardization catalog, and ties in with the asset request and really enables that ongoing day-to-day management of the asset all the way through disposal. But we also talked about in the previous demonstration, Ivanti neurons for discovery, which works hand in hand with the asset management repository to make sure that you're finding what's current out on the environment, and that it has refreshed data as far as current user, current logon, IP address, current installed software, and that's going to ultimately feed up into your software entitlement, software asset management. So just remember, it's kind of a two-fisted approach, right? Ivanti neurons, it's kind of like what its name implies, that's really the brains of the operation around the discovery aspects of it. The Ivanti ITAM aspects of it is really the brawn behind the solution. That's where you're going to do your day-to-day life cycle management and ongoing workflows for customer support.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Rob, and thank you, Paul, for presenting today. Hopefully, everyone out there got a lot out of this particular session. We'll meet again here in a couple more weeks, same time, and we'll, as we said, we'll march up the maturity curve and show you two more aspects of best practices, as well as demonstrate how that can be manifest itself within the Ivanti portfolio. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a very good day.
great. Thanks, everyone.